So good morning, everyone. It's nice that we can experience the weather being a little bit more moderate, and we can do our meditation without the air conditioners. Very nice. So today I'm going to give a talk on the sequence that has been started, that our good friend Caddy has been also giving talks about the Tiantai school, and my effort has been to try to give some of the background as to the practices as it relates to our own meditation practice here at Chan Monastery. So I spoke last time, for those of you who were here, about the Bugo Bujing, neither impure nor pure, which is a version of understanding the first of the 5 sequences of what's called the Wuting Xingguan, the 5 stabilization mind contemplations. And today I'm going to talk about part 2, the insight on the next level of practice. So just to give a little background, in trying to make this accessible and not quite so esoteric, I like to talk about the 4 C's with a smile. First is calming the mind, which we call shamatha, and the second is called clear or special insight into the mind and experience, which is called vipassana. In Chinese, guan, which is what we're going to be talking about today, that pathway. The third is called loving kindness, and that's where I put the smile because, of course, it doesn't begin with a C, unless you add compassion there. So loving kindness, of course it doesn't begin with a C, unless you add compassion there. So loving kindness and compassion, which turns out to be something that's very connected today with our topic number 2 about insight. And then 4, which is deep concentration. Not the kind of mundane concentration, but a very deep concentration or a deep penetration, which we would call the jhanas. So these 4 are these 4 pathways. These are the things that we develop in the mind: shamatha, vipassana, and then the 4 Brahma-vihara, as we call them, these 4 states that begin with loving kindness and continue to compassion, and then altruistic joy and equanimity, and then concentration, which has some different terms. Sometimes jhana is the term that's used, dhyana, which is the Sanskrit version of that, chan, which is the Chinese version of that, and also the word samadhi is also used. So these are different pathways that we take in order to cultivate the mind. So today, talking about insight, that second pathway, we're using as a root text a text called the Sutra on the Concentration of Sitting Meditation that was brought to China by Kumrajiva and translated we believe in the year 401 because it was that year that Kumarajiva was invited to the capital at that time, which was Chang'an, which is the same city as Xi'an. And for people who are familiar with China, Xi'an is a favorite tourist spot now because of the terracotta warriors buried there. But this is during the fifth or very beginning of the 5th century. The story is that Kumarajiva was invited after he was actually in prison for maybe 16 years. He was invited by the emperor to come to the capital, and we know that that year was 401, and the very first task that he was given was to translate this sutra on concentration, on sitting meditation, and we understand that he did the translation in 6 days. This is the story that's written. So this particular text literally means, the first character means sitting, and then chime, meditation, and then samadhi, discourse. So here we can see the actual terms that were used. So in this text that was actually, there was a famous monk that was there who was the one who convinced the emperor to invite Kumarajiva to the capital. He did a preface to this practice, and in this preface he talks about the importance of this particular text and gives the story about how it came to be translated. And he also gives a number of sources of how this text was originally written in Sanskrit by great Sanskrit masters, and he gave a list of them. I'm not going to go through that, but just to show the provenance, the importance, the lineage of this particular text and how authentic it is. And how it was actually preceded in China by the great translator An Qinggao, who had translated an earlier text called the Great Sutra on Mindfulness of Inhalation and Exhalation, which does not yet exist in English, but it might exist in English someday. We will surprise you with that, when that takes place. So in this preface, the monk who had invited Kumarajiva gives an explanation of how important this text is and how it was based on this earlier first or second century translation of this other text. Lots of text. So the very first part of this book that was written or translated by Kumarajiva begins with a section which we now call the Wu Ting Xingguan, the 5 approaches to meditation, or the 5 stabilization of mind contemplation practices. And last time, as I said, I gave a little bit of a talk on the first part called the Bujingguan. Bujing means not pure contemplation. So this has to do with insight into how the mind is impermanent, unsatisfactory, how our experiences all phenomenon are impermanent, unsatisfactory, and how they're neither pure nor impure. This was my interpretation of the meaning of this, and I had given some documentation as to why I was looking at it from this point of view. The second section, which I want to talk about here today, is called the Zibei Guan. This is the insight into loving kindness and compassion. So just like in the Bujing Guan, where there's some ambiguity about the meaning of the terms, even though Zibei is very commonly understood as loving kindness and compassion, these terms in Chinese are used automatically together more often than separately. And as a result of that, in the early Pali terms of loving kindness, metta, and the term for compassion, karuna, we wouldn't necessarily see those terms joined together as one term. We wouldn't normally see in the Pali metta, karuna as one term, but when it gets to the Chinese, Zibei is almost like one term. And oftentimes it's just translated as loving kindness or friendliness. And as a result of that, we have to look more deeply into the meaning in the text. So, as an overview, each of the sections of this 5 stabilization practices are directly related to a hindrance that can happen in the mind, or an obstacle or a difficulty that the mind has. The first one has to do with craving, sense-based craving. So we want to overcome that sense-based craving, so we look at things as being not pure or not so desirable. And the second one has to do with overcoming anger and hatred. It's the one that I want to talk about today. And so on and so forth. Each one has a particular meaning of what we're trying to overcome. So when we look at the insight into loving kindness and compassion, this is to help when we have this propensity toward anger. It's beneficial to focus the mind on the contemplation of loving kindness, on metta, and on compassion. So this brings us to an understanding a little bit about the hindrances. The hindrances follow the same 5 steps of things that can get in the way seriously of our ability to make progress. And the second one is this aversion or ill will. And if we look at this more clearly, we see that aversion or ill will, the term in Pali is bhayapada, which means, pada means path, and bhaya means, in this case, to go in the other direction of. When we run across something that's aversive to us, we go in the other direction. We try to get away from it. So this feeling of anger or malice or harm that comes into the mind is this reaction to something that we want to get away from. So the Chinese actually means to glare at someone with obvious anger or hatred. And the term actually etymologically is when a slave looks at the master, somebody who, in this case, is a negative connotation to the term slave owner. When the slave looks at the slave owner, there's an obvious hatred, aversion that one has to the slave owner. And this is the sense that is so strong that happens within us. So returning now to the sitting meditation samadhi discourse, and the first part, which is called the 5 stabilizations of mind contemplation. contemplation, and then now we're going to the second part, which is the Xiankuan, the insight into loving kindness and compassion. We actually look at the text itself, and it says, if anger is predominant, one should practice 3 types of cultivation of loving kindness. An introductory part, an intermediate part, and for the advanced practitioner. So it continues, if the practitioner is at the introductory level, the master should teach him as follows. Extend loving kindness to people that one likes. And how does one extend loving kindness to people that one likes and wish to comfort them? Now, so I put in parentheses here, compassion, because when we wish to give someone comfort, that's a little bit further than just wishing them well or wishing them happiness. We actually want to help them because we know that they're suffering, so we want to give them comfort. This is the compassion here. So if a practitioner obtains various comfortable things for the body and mind, such as clothing when one is cold, and coolness when one is hot, and food and drink when one is hungry and thirsty, richness when one is poor, rest when one has traveled too much. The practitioner wishes to extend these comforts to people like this, that he likes. And so this is just the beginning level. This is the introductory level. And if the mind gets distracted away from loving kindness, and if what one does is one brings oneself right back to the practice. So if it gets distracted, we just return back. So on the intermediate level, the person extends loving kindness to neutral people in the same way. If a person needs something, we have this gratitude and we have this generosity towards them, and we want to help them out. So this is one level of loving kindness also that's extended out to the person at the very beginning of this teaching. And if you get distracted, just bring yourself back. And on the advanced level, one extends loving kindness to hostile people, people who are difficult, troublesome people in the same way. So as an explanation for this, why and how do we do this, we also reflect on the benevolent virtue of the practice of boundless, vast power of loving kindness, and that one should not lose it. If one should contemplate as follows, if there were no hostile people, how could one cultivate patience? Giving rise to patience depends on hostile people, and thus hostile people are our benefactors. So this brings us to a very famous story that I like very much, and sometimes I use it in my clinical practice when a person will come in and start complaining about a member of their family. So maybe a spouse or someone like that, and they complain about how difficult that person is. So the very famous story is about a teacher who is invited to Tibet to give Dharma talks, and the emissary comes and asks him if he would please come, and the teacher says, "Tell me about the people of Tibet." And he says, "Oh, they're wonderful, they're loving, kind, and interested." And the teacher says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't come." And this happens a number of times until the third time the emissary comes, and the teacher says, "Tell me about the people of Tibet." He says, "Oh, they're wonderful, kind, and they're very interested." And the teacher says, "Can I bring an attendant with me?" And the emissary says, "Well, of course you can bring 100 attendants." He says, "Oh no, I only need one to make tea in the morning, And so he brings this one attendant with him, and soon everyone realizes that this attendant is a very gruff old man who's always complaining, always finding the negative way of looking at things. And the teacher goes throughout Tibet, and indeed the people are loving and kind, and they're very interested. And at the end of the tour, the emissary says, "Oh, I'm so glad that you came, but I have a question for you." He says, "Oh yes, what is that?" He says, "Why is it that you brought this particular attendant? I don't want to say anything about him, but just why did you bring him?" He said, "Oh, the gruff old man." Yes, he says, "Oh yes, well, the first 3 times you came to ask me to give talks, I said no, because I was very concerned about how I would be able to continue my practice of loving kindness and compassion." So sometimes when we're with a difficult situation or a difficult person, someone treats us with hostility, and gruff and negative, I remind myself of this story, and I now can use these verses to help me also, because of how important it is to see that without this difficulty, how could we can really understand compassion. So loving kindness is the practice is very straightforward. In loving kindness, we start off with ourselves, because we have this natural tendency to want to experience loving kindness for ourselves. And we then go on to a dear loved one, and then to a friend or a relative. So these are all people who we know well, and we want to give loving kindness. So it naturally helps us to bring forth this feeling within ourselves of loving kindness. And then we extend this to a neutral person, and then to a troublesome adversary, the hostile person, difficult person. And then usually teachers then go to all beings everywhere. I have a problem with all beings everywhere because I always feel like I'm leaving somebody out. So to solve that problem, I inserted in my own practice a group of people somewhere in the world. So depending on what's going on in the world, I can focus my mind on this group of people. It doesn't have to be a group that's suffering, but it can be. And so I have this group that I focus on. So for each one of these, I have kind of a default person for myself, unless someone else uniquely pops into my mind that day. I stay with certainly myself. I can't come up with an alternative for that yet. And then the dear loved one, usually my wife or one of my children. And so when we go through it, we just stay with that person for each group. And then a friend, I have certainly people that in California particularly, good close friends. Neutral person for many years was a lady who waited on me at Panera Bread, at the bread company. And as the funny story goes, one day I went into my waiting room and I realized that sitting in the chair was my neutral person. Oh no, I'm going to have to come up with a whole new neutral person now, because now I know this person well, or I'm going to get to know them well. Then, of course, the troublesome adversary. Now, the troublesome adversary, I have different people who have given me trouble over the years. But sometimes the troublesome adversary is the dear loved one. Sometimes the troublesome adversary can be ourselves. So the formula that is used, The one that I've adopted for my own practice is the Sharon Salzberg model. Sharon Salzberg is one of the people who went during the 70s to Burma and to Thailand and practiced there. Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, a group of Americans who went to Southeast Asia, and they brought the practice back. The original verses were contained levels of meaning that would take a person a while to really understand. And so rather than to use that kind of specialized language, she adopted something that was easier for Western people to access without having to know the deeper teachings. So she came up with this, may I be safe, may I be happy, may I be healthy, may I live with ease. So this is a very good practice. And then she also in my practice, I use the verses that we do here at Maba, and I've looked high and low for the original, and I found 2 citations on the internet, of course, the great source of knowledge, but I haven't been able to find the original text. Instead, I found the original text for the reflection on food, but I wasn't able to find the original text. But I found it in a book on the Introduction to Buddhism by a very good monastic. So we know that it's a good text, but I haven't been able to find the original yet. So I abridge it a little bit for beginning people, so it's not so long. And may I be free from anger and hatred. May I be free from greed and selfishness. May I be free from fears and anxiety. May I be free from all pain and suffering. May I live peacefully, to make it a little bit easier to memorize. So the original we have in our chanting book. So in addition to understanding the loving kindness practice, it's very helpful to realize that this is part of a sequence of loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity, and also to understand that the character loving kindness is a picture etymologically of children growing out of the heart. So the heart is nurturing, just like a mother's heart would nurture children. Our heart brings forth this loving kindness, the wish for other people to be happy. And in addition to this, if we practice loving kindness, we also will become familiar with what's called the Metta Sutta, which is the text that talks about how the Buddha gave the teachings of loving kindness to a group of monks who had gone out into the forest, had learned to practice meditation, but not this particular practice, and they were sitting and doing meditation, and in the forest there were these disturbed beings who were mischievous and would try to frighten the monks while they were meditating. This is the story. So maybe they were somehow, to some degree, not peaceful in their own mind, these mysterious beings. And so the monks became frightened, and they went back to the Buddha and they told him what had happened, and the Buddha gave them these verses to practice. And they went back to the forest and practiced these verses, and it calmed the minds of the mysterious, disturbed beings that were there. And so sometimes we recite the Metta Sutta, This is what should be done by one who is skilled and in goodness, and who knows the path of peace. And so we practice this here as a way of really helping calm our mysterious and disturbed mind. So in addition to this, there's also the teaching called the Brahma Vihara in the near and the far enemy, which is expounded upon in Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga in the 5th century, where he says that there is what's called, for each quality, a near enemy and a far enemy. So the far enemy is someone we can see a long way off and we know, oh, that person or quality is trouble, I'll stay away from that. The near enemy is someone who's walking alongside of us and looks like our friend but pulling us in the wrong direction. I'm hoping all of us here today will come with me to the casino afterwards. This is being the near enemy, the good friend who leads you astray. So what is the far enemy of loving kindness? Well, ill will, anger, and fear. And what is the near enemy of loving kindness? Too much attachment, too much wanting. This looks like loving kindness sometimes. Oh, I love you so much, I don't want you to leave the house. I want you to stay with me all the time. This kind of codependency, we might call it in psychology today. And the far enemy of compassion is to cause someone pain, cruelty, even more than ill will. And the near enemy of compassion, which is our desire to want to help someone who's in despair or in pain, is that it becomes so much that we become overcome by it. We attach to their pain and we make it our own pain. So we stop being able to be compassionate. It's like the EMT worker who comes and helps us when we've been in a car accident, hopefully not, but if we were, we wouldn't want the emergency worker to come and be overcome by how much he cares for us. Oh my gosh, Don, you've broken your arm. This is terrible. I can hardly look at it. This is too much. We want the person to have a dispassion when they're helping us. We want them to care, but not so much that they can't function. So this is the true meaning of compassion. So when we look at compassion practice, particularly, this is not as so developed in the Wutin Xingguan. This practice is, in fact, kind of dovetailed into loving kindness and is not so highly developed. When we go to the Tibetan schools, we see that compassion meditation is much more developed as a specific, separate practice. And this actually is based on the original Visuddhimagga, where a person is actually directed to do compassion practice a little bit, certainly differently than loving kindness. And in the Visuddhimagga, they talk about how a person would begin to develop this sense of compassion by starting with the very unfortunate being, a person without arms and legs living on the street, unable to take care of themselves. Now, in the current method of developing compassion that's done today at the Buddhist monasteries or at Stanford, at Seacare, and the people who are doing compassion training and psychotherapy, they leave out the very unfortunate being and they start with the dear loved one. And then they go to the neutral person and then to the adversary. That's the first set. And then in the second set, you go to yourself, the dear relative, and then to all beings everywhere. And of course, I insert a group of people, so I don't feel like I've left anybody out. And how this is done in the Tibetan tradition is that they picture this person. They know that this person suffers from time to time, and they see that suffering as a dark cloud that surrounds them. And then they do something a little unusual. They inhale intentionally the dark cloud that surrounds this person, and they bring it directly into their heart center. And with the strong wish that they have to transform this into the white light of compassion, then they send this white light of compassion out to the person on 3 breaths, intentional breaths. So 1 intentional breath in, 3 intentional breaths out. This is the practice called Tung Lun in the Tibetan tradition. And again, it's based on the 5th century Theravadan text, the Visuddhimagga, but Visuddhimagga doesn't go into such detail as to how to practice it. It just gives you the sequence. So these are the practices that are in the Wuti Xiankuan. This is what the next step after a person develops the understanding of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and neither impure nor pure. Then the next stage is to practice deep loving kindness and compassion, to have that permeate the entire being. So there is a set of verses that are very commonly recited that go along with this, and each one of the 4 verses relates to the 4 Brahmavihara states of loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. So we can do this. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the altruistic joy which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity which is free from attachment, aversion, and ignorance.